I think a big part of the reason that I interact with the Fire Emblem fanbase more so than any other is because no two Fire Emblem fans have the exact same personal ranking of the series. For almost any given Fire Emblem game, you can easily find fringe groups of people who talk about it like it's their spouse, and people who talk about it like it killed their entire family in front of them and then gouge their eyes out to make sure that's one of the last things they ever see. You are not a true Fire Emblem fan unless you have at least one contrarian opinion. And if there's one Fire Emblem opinion I have that's truly contrarian, it's the fact that my favorite character in the series is the alcoholic gambling addict who no one in universe likes. But if there's a second Fire Emblem opinion I have that's truly contrarian, it's the fact that, at least as of scripting, I would completely and 100% unironically consider FE1 to be a top 5 Fire Emblem game. When you look at tier lists / ranking videos for Fire Emblem, FE1 is usually near the bottom. The two most common opinions I see on FE1 are that it's near unplayable because of its age, or that it's fine but still one of the weakest entries in the series. I do get why these opinions are prevalent. A large portion of the NES library hasn't exactly aged the most gracefully.
It's The Legend of Zelda and it's really rad!
So it's to be expected that there's a lot of legitimate issues with FE1. It's slow to a ridiculous degree, trading is in its most primitive form, and the pre-map preparations leave a lot to be desired. But in spite of all of that, I still think it has a lot going for it that other Fire Emblem games don't have. And to address what I assume will be an elephant in the room, yes, the remake FE11 is an improvement in a lot of regards, to the point where it just is my favorite game in the series. But I kind of hate the mentality in gaming circles that remakes can render the original completely obsolete. In an interview with Masahiro Sakurai, one of the producers of FE11 stated that he sees the game as a totally new work rather than just being a remake, and that's how I prefer to see these two games. Two completely different interpretations of the same chain of events that both have different strengths and weaknesses. I still think there's a lot of things that FE1 has over FE11 and things that just make it worth visiting today in general, so I'm going to go over those things. Starting with aspects that apply to both it and its remake, and then working my way to things that apply to only it. The first thing I want to talk about is the story, because there really isn't much to talk about. It's your basic medieval fantasy story. Marth is your standard good guy, Garneth and Medius are your standard bad guys, the majority of the playable cast personality traits are either alive or dead, and the closest thing to a deeper theme being explored is war kinda bad, I guess. This isn't to say that there aren't aspects of it that I like though. Sheeta is a fun character, Michaelis is a decent side villain because he's effectively a fascist dictator who sees control of his own country, and I made a whole video on why I like Mathis. None of this is enough for FE11 to be the basic medieval fantasy allegations though. You could make the argument that it's an advanced story for its time, and while that is true to some extent, there are still plenty of games from before FE1 that had explored more complex themes, so it's not exactly a free pass. But what I think separates FE1's story from other FE stories that aren't particularly good is that it's just a couple of lines of dialogue and isn't that much of a focus. Compare that to something like Fates, where the story is significantly lengthier and also one of the main things emphasized in the game's branding. At the end of the day, FE1's story is just there to be a setup for the gameplay. And that gameplay is pretty damn good. The mechanics of FE1 are really simple. No mission types that aren't seized until the final boss, no weapon triangle, no skills, no rescue / pair up / whatever, and no reclassing unless you're playing the remake. But simplicity isn't an inherently bad thing, as the streamlined mechanics have a nice feel. You won't ever have to deal with stuff like Fog of War, boring route maps, and the bullshit that Skill Emblem likes to pull at points. The map design is genuinely really good, some of the best in the series in fact. It nails the main things that Fire Emblem maps should do. Make sure enemies are actively pursuing you, have multiple paths to keep things from getting stale, and include time-sensitive rewards to encourage the player to go fast. But an underappreciated aspect of FE1's map design is how it's used to elevate the story, as basic as said story may be. For example, take the two maps that Minerva appears in. At the beginning of Chapter 7, Minerva is an enemy Draco Knight at a point where you've only fought a single pre-promote. This Draco Knight and her squad of Pegasus Knights are rapidly approaching you, causing the average player to panic and wonder how they're going to deal with them all at once. But before they can even so much as touch you, they leave the battle, hinting that there's more to them than you might expect. Then in Chapter 10, you make a deal with Minerva where if you rescue her sister, she'll join up with you. I love how, as opposed to FE11 where she's mostly stationary until Maria is recruited, FE1 has it so that she's actively following you, even if she's not attacking. It's as if she's asserting her dominance and keeping watch to make sure you fulfill your end of the bargain. In modern Fire Emblem games, Minerva's story would have just been told in a cutscene and you'd get her outside of the actual gameplay. But because said story was told through the gameplay, it feels way more natural. And her character arc isn't the only example of this. There's stuff like the desert map, where Garno's complete immortality is conveyed by a brief encounter with him where you have no hope of defeating him, and Chapter 12, where you have to control a squad of units locked in jail and make sure they don't get killed by a nearby archer. Speaking of units getting killed, one of the biggest strengths of both FE1 and its remake is their emphasis on permadeath. I've talked about this before, but FE1 was designed under the assumption that the player would not reset for every death, and this shows in the finished product. The cast of units is large enough that you'll more often than not be able to get a replacement for the one you just lost. My very first playthrough of FE1 was also my very first attempt at an Iron Man run, and I can confirm that FE1 and its remake are the two games in the series that are the most welcoming to this playstyle. If you're a Fire Emblem fan who hasn't done an Iron Man yet, I urge you to correct that immediately because it's some of the most fun you'll ever have with the series. It's my personal belief that Fire Emblem is at its strongest when it serves as a tool for making your own story through permadeath and other random features, which is why Iron Mans are so exhilarating to play. But this is where FE1 and FE11 start to have major differences. FE11 has higher enemy quality than FE1, especially on higher difficulties, as well as an infinite amount of replacements for your dead units. So the difficulty comes from the short-term experience of playing the maps. FE1, on the other hand, has lower enemy quality, but has a chaos that, while decently large, is still finite. So its difficulty instead comes more so from the long-term management of units. If a unit dies in FE1, it could very well snowball, whether you're getting locked out of recruiting other units, or you're now unable to do something as easily as you would have if the unit in question was alive. And I find this type of difficulty to be really compelling. I love the feeling that at any moment, something could go wrong and I could be locked out of winning. In fact, FE1 effectively has a bad ending. If you don't get the 2 orbs in Chapter 19, give them to Godo so he can create the Starlight Tome, and then defeat Garnef with it, you're locked out of the most consistent way of defeating the final boss. And this is clearly communicated to the player, so if you mess it up, that's entirely on you. FE11 changes so that not only does Medius have an additional weakness in the form of Divine Dragons, but if your Divine Dragon is dead and you don't have the Falchion, you get to go to an additional chapter where you get both of those things right before the final showdown. I get why this was changed, and don't fault the FE11 devs for doing so. But still, there's something so compelling about FE1 having this type of loss condition if you really screw up. Another thing that separates FE1 from its remake and the series as a whole is the way classes are handled. Only 6 classes in the game are capable of promotion: Cavaliers, Mercs, Archers, Mages, Curates, and Pegs. I personally see that number as 5 though, because there's no way the average player is going out of their way to do the ridiculous amount of grinding needed to promote a Curate in this game. Anyways, there's plenty of classes like Fighters, Knights, and Pirates that are able to promote in most FE games, but just don't in this one. So this creates an interesting dynamic where units are significantly more distinct from each other than they would be in other games. There's Castro the Hunter and Gordon the Archer, where one has higher stats in the short term, but the other has the ability to promote and get better in the long term. Or there's the 4 Knights versus the 1 General. Yeah, believe it or not, Knights and Generals used to be completely separate from each other. And since Knights have access to both swords and lances, while Generals only have swords, you get to choose between a unit with a 1-2 range option or a unit with better stats. Stats are yet another thing that are handled completely differently in FE1 than in future games. While not the only Kage-era game to do this, stats cap out at a relatively low 20. This helps keep the game from getting so easy that it's boring, because you will never truly be so bulky that you're safe from damage. On the flip side, since it also applies to enemies as well, it prevents FE1 from falling for one of the common pitfalls of NES RPGs: grinding. In a similar boat, the stat boosters in FE1 are ridiculous. The Power Ring gives twice as much as 2 points you'd expect from future games, and plenty of the other ones give you even more than that.
5 points!
Since the ceiling of unit viability is low due to how caps work, taking a couple stat boosters is all a weaker unit needs to do to catch up to your stronger ones. For example, despite Jigen having growths that look like this, stat boosters can still make him viable in the mid to late game and arguably a high tier unit. But the most ridiculous of the stat boosters is the Talisman, not just because it gives 7 points, but because it is your only way of permanently increasing resistance. You see, every single playable unit has a resistance growth of 0%, and there is only a single unit in the entire game, whether blue or red, who has a base resistance stat that isn't 0. When combined with the fact that tomes don't take strength into consideration in FE1, magic is essentially fixed damage, giving it a unique feel. The last stat related thing I want to bring up is weapon level. In most FE games, weapon levels are separate from each other, so for example, a paladin could have an A in swords and a B in lances. However, in FE1 and FE3, weapon level is 1 stat, making the process of using stronger weapons significantly more streamlined. I'm sure we've all had that one unit that would have had access to a really good tool if said tool didn't require you to grind a ridiculous amount of weapon XP. Like in my current playthrough of Thracia, I was thinking about how sick it would be to give rewarp to Asbel, but then I remembered that he only had a D in staves. But you'll never have to worry about this happening in FE1. Another thing that really stands out about FE1 is presentation. I'm really biased towards late 80s / early 90s anime aesthetics, and FE1's character portraits exude those vibes. Now, I'm sure that me liking these portraits is an absolute surprise to everyone watching this, but they really do show what it's like when a console is near the end of its lifespan, and the people working on it truly understand what it's capable of aesthetically. My favorite is this smug piece of shit you can find in some houses. I want to punch him in the face, parentheses affectionate. I also like the battle animations to a lesser extent. They're fairly advanced by the standards of the NES, and the aesthetic of a pitch black void makes combat feel more tense when combined with the music. The latter was most likely done because of technical limitations instead of an artistic reason, but I don't care, it still looks cool to me. There's plenty of other oddities I could talk about in FE1, especially if I were to open the floodgates and bring up glitches. But I don't have all day to discuss every tiny detail of a 27-hour game, so I'm going to end this video with the thing that truly sets FE1 apart from the rest of the series. The man, the myth, the legend, FE1 Marth. Marth is at the top of basically any viability tier list for FE1, and he is quite possibly the single unit in Fire Emblem that I've had the most fun using. He's one of the few characters in the series to have not just one, not even two, but three personal weapons. First, he starts with the rapier, which is exactly as it is in the majority of games in the series. Second, he gets Mercurius from S, which has the gimmick of allowing him to sometimes get 2 points in a stat when he levels up instead of just 1. Not exactly the best thing in the world, since he's at a point where he's not going to get that much more level ups, but still neat nonetheless. And finally, there's a sword he uses in most future incarnations, the Falchion. Now, if you're basing it on, say, the FE11 version, it's already really good. It's a strong enough weapon with low weight, it has infinite uses, it allows Marth to heal, and it's the main weakness of the final boss. But surprisingly enough, the FE11 version was actually nerfed from the original one. In FE1, it makes Marth completely immune to all one-range attacks just as long as they aren't magical or from Manicheets. So it lets the player treat the last two chapters like some kind of victory lap. However, the thing that makes Marth the best unit in the game isn't actually the Falchion, or any sword for that matter. You see, because FE1 was designed under the assumption that a player wouldn't reset, the devs had to make sure there was a clear short-term game over condition. So this caused FE1 to have completely different enemy AI to the FE games that would follow it up. In later games in the series, enemies prioritize hitting units they could kill and to assure ones that can't hit back. But in FE1, their top priority is going after Marth. If Marth is in range, they will almost always attack him. And while AI manipulation exists to some extent in every Fire Emblem game, no Fire Emblem game lets you do it with the level of ease and amount of applications that FE1 Marth does. You could feed him stat boosters to make him an enemy phase tank. You could deliberately equip the rapier to take out any troublesome mounted units. You could use them to bring in one of your more frail units without having to worry about them dying. The possibilities are endless. There are absolutely units who are more overpowered than FE1 Marth. Robin, Seth, Zigoldo-chan-san, Sama Senpai. But none are as fun to use as FE1 Marth. I also think this mechanic does a good job at characterizing both the setting and Marth himself. In regards to the former, it shows the level of danger Marth is under and how he's never truly safe. As for the latter, the strategies you can do with this mechanic characterize Marth as someone who's willing to put himself in danger to help others without a single line of dialogue. With all these mechanics combined, FE1 just has a unique feel. To explain said feel, I have to go on a bit of a tangent. You see, a couple months ago, I was marathoning a bunch of Sega Genesis games because I had a collection of them and I wanted to start clearing out my backlog. One of these games that stood out the most to me was Sword of Vermilion, an RPG from an early point of the console's lifespan. The combat is janky, the UI is so bad that guides have to have an entire section just to explain it, and overall it just feels like a joke at the player's expense. I eventually threw in the towel, quit the game, and turned it into a meme amongst my friend group to the point where I made it the first game I booted up on the new laptop I got for my birthday. I can't bring myself to say that I hate this game though. It has this weird charm of representing an era of games where companies didn't know what works and what doesn't, so they were pretty much just throwing shit against the wall and seeing what sticks. And I can't help but draw a parallel between it and FE1. For all the NES RPGs like Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, Mother 1, Sweet Home, and yes, even FE1 that still get talked about today for what they eventually spawned, there's probably even more that have been lost to time and completely forgotten about. But there's little in the content of the games themselves that separate the ones that succeeded and the ones that failed. What makes FE1 stand out to me is how it represents a time where my favorite game series wasn't the absolute juggernaut it is now. In fact, in the Sakurai interview I mentioned earlier, the FE11 2011 producer actually mentioned that FE1 initially sold poorly in its first 2 months, but it eventually picked up in sales because of word of mouth. The very definition of humble beginnings. Before the games became way larger in scope, before the characters made it to the biggest party game in the world, and before people who unironically use the word waifu became an incredibly lucrative market, there was just some little RPG with bad UI and weird mechanics. Also, here's the list of FE games I unironically prefer FE1 to. Feel free to complain about it in a way that helps this video do better in the algorithm.